Hey, my name is Sanjay, and today we're going to talk about Mr. and Mrs. Smith, which is both a film and recently a series. The film stars Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie as the titular characters, John and Jane Smith, a married couple who just so happen to be assassins. I like to refer to them as spies because it's more accurate, but who cares? The only catch is neither knows the other is a spy, and it's something they hide from each other. The series is more or less the same, with Donald Glover playing John and Maya Erskine playing Jane, a couple of spies recently matched up by an organization, quote-unquote, or a disembodied voice they refer to as Hi-Hi. I'm going to start out first by discussing the film naturally, as Glover's show is a reboot of it. There will be spoilers for the movie. It came out in 2005, so if you haven't seen it, you probably won't. However, I won't be spoiling the series as it's much newer, and I do want people to check it out. Without further ado, let's get started. So when it comes to the film, I think it's just alright. I actually never heard of this film before the show was announced. Goes to show my media prowess, I guess. To be fair, I was 5 when this film released, so cut me some slack. Anyway, I went in with a bit of biased opinion about it. I'd seen the trailer, which didn't strike me as anything too spectacular, and I've been keeping up with opinions online about the newly released show, and I've been seeing that fans of this film are too keen on the reboot. Shocking. I've seen comments ranging from Hollywood is just obsessed with ruining classic films, to make a quick buck, to this show is just forcing a quote-unquote woke agenda, and also that there is nothing wrong with Pitt and Jolie, and the reboot shouldn't exist. Of course, I reject all these sentiments. As a brief side note, I feel like it's virtually impossible these days to reboot anything with reimagined characters that are different races without being harassed by the anti-woke crowd. It's par for the course at this point. I often find myself wondering if the reboot actors/actresses had been white, would this even be a factor? The hate for the show seems to stem mostly from the fact that the couple is now interracial, a detail that has little to no implication on the two characters. Well, it kind of does in one episode, but that's for later. Anywho, the movie starts off with a faux interview of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and what we come to learn is marriage counseling. Apparently, they've been having difficulties in their relationship. The counselor asks them to walk him through it, and we get a tried and true flashback to how the pair met. If I were to describe the sequence in one word, it would be cliché. After having obviously done some spy shit, Brad Pitt's character walks into a hotel lobby, I think, and the police run in after him looking for a lone suspect. Not long after the police begin questioning him, Angelina Jolie's character waltzes in and bam, romance happens. I must admit, I'm not a fan of the whole forced romance trope where two characters are forced into a situation where they have to pretend to be in love or something bad will happen. I think it's boring and overused at this point and really cuts through interesting character development to get to the part that people want to see, which is two A-list actors screwing. John and Jane hit it off, they dance sexily in the rain, and they get busy. We're 5 minutes into the film and I'm already scratching my head. Why did, when Jolie walked in, she just go along with Pitt saying that she was his wife? Sure, the authorities were questioning them both since they were both alone, but he's a complete stranger, and afterward, neither even asks who they are or what they were doing to get them under suspicion. At this point, of course, neither knows the other is a spy, so we have to have them figure it out in some unforced way that they each have spy-like abilities or whatever. We get the obligatory cutesy fair scene where they both learn the other is great with a gun. I'd been rolling my eyes so much through this entire setup that you'd think I was Thomas the freaking Tank Engine. So I don't want to recap the entire plot of this film for you guys. I just thought the opening scenes were funny in a bad way, and I needed to point them out. From here on out, I'm just going to skip around in the film for a bit and point out areas of interest I found. So about 45 minutes into the film, they both learn of the other's secret identity that they've been hiding from each other for about 5 or 6 years. This felt wrong to me. How could these two trained assassins not be able to figure out the other was hiding something? In one scene, Jolie is changing just out of view out of a rubber corset that she was wearing to a mission, and Pitt is standing across the room talking to her without walking over to notice what she's wearing. It was clear he was told to stay over there, but based on what we've seen of his character so far, it just didn't make any sense. This dude is horny. Why wouldn't he want to watch his wife change? It just felt odd. Like, have these two never once gone through each other's things? In the show, there's a scene in one of the early episodes where one of the characters does just that, and it makes perfect sense. This is someone you're living with, and come on. We've all had that curiosity. It's especially weird considering these two buzz in and out of their house constantly. Surely one or both would be like, I wonder where the other is going. No? And in 5 or 6 years of marriage, they never once thought to figure out why they had such odd names like Jane Doe and John Smith. These are literally the generic names. That never stood out as weird to either of them. I know the film isn't supposed to be taken so seriously, and I appreciate the tone throughout manages to stay pretty consistently comical, but still, we're supposed to believe that these people are spy geniuses or whatever, and they miss some pretty obvious details about each other, and that makes no sense. The entire second act of the film becomes a cat and mouse chase between the two. Their secrets have been revealed, and now it's time to kill each other, I guess. Now, I did find these scenes to be more entertaining than the ones from the first act of the film. However, I still found myself a bit disinterested in what was happening on screen. Their reasons for wanting to kill each other never made much sense to me either. It's stated that the agencies they work for are rivals, but why is that? It's never explained. Why couldn't these two spies coexist? Why did they have to kill each other? Surely it would be more effective to have agents double up and work together, right? Or maybe the agents are rivals because Pitt's agency consists mostly of men and Jolie's consists mostly of women. Yeah, that makes sense. Early 2000s logic. While we're at it, I should mention the sexism in this film is off the charts. There's a scene where a friend of Pitt's talks down to a waitress, calls her honey and baby a bunch. The standard stuff, really. And throughout the film, this same friend calls Jolie a bitch a handful of times. Anyway, probably my favorite part of the film is about an hour and 15 into it when the two get home and begin yet again attempting to kill each other. Yeah, there's a lot of plot armor and stormtrooper aiming happening here, which is a critique I have for this film as well as the series. For trained assassins, these people cannot aim for shit. Like, how are they missing a target that is 2 feet in front of them? It's bonkers. So they go ballistic on each other, destroying most of their house, and when neither can shoot the other, they make out and fuck like a good married couple who happen to be spies, and who 2 seconds ago wanted to murder each other should. This scene is remade in the reboot, and is done pretty effectively there, but again, that's for later discussion. Afterward, we learn there's a bounty on both of their heads put there by their organization. The details get a little hazy for me at this point. I can't tell if their man organization and woman organizations have put together separate hits, or it's one collective organization that both factions work for put out an all-encompassing hit on them. Anyway, their house is raided by the organization, and they have to figure a way out. The finale takes place in a closed mall in a scene that is decently choreographed and mildly entertaining. I use these qualifiers because the threat of death is so low in all the final scenes. Like, I knew that neither would want to kill the other, and I knew for sure that the organization wasn't going to actually get to kill either of them either. Somehow, the pair manages to defeat the organization and escapes almost entirely scot-free, which feels weird considering this is an organization full of trained assassins that can't kill 2 people. In the final scenes, they were fighting essentially a small army, and they somehow won. Like, okay, they saved the day, and their marriage, the end. Overall, the movie wasn't awful. Like I said, I was unaware of its cult following until the reboot was announced. But yeah, I can see why the average moviegoer would enjoy this film. It has 2 likable lead actors whom apparently had a real-life affair with each other while the movie was shooting, or whatever, which is interesting, and a decently interesting story. Number ratings are definitely arbitrary, but I need some way to rate the things I review, so if I had to, I'd give this film a 5 out of 10. It isn't the worst, but it isn't great either. I have a few smaller points to make that didn't fit into my wider review/recap of the film that I'll go over here. Some of these points are pretty pedantic, so bear with me. So many people rave about how sexy this film is, and I just don't see it. I know, everyone's gonna call me a contrarian or whatever, but I don't think this film is very sexy. Sure, there are a few sexy scenes, but even those felt a bit stunted in some way. Nothing about either of the lead actors' performances screamed sexy to me. I think people misconstrue the supposed sexiness of the actors for the sexiness of the film itself. On a similar note, I think the main characters are just bland. We know virtually nothing about Jane and John except they're assassins. They have no discernible characteristics whatsoever. I was over halfway through the movie when I realized that we don't even know shit about these characters. They meet, fall in love almost immediately, and then get married. That's pretty much it. There aren't any solid character-defining moments in the film that make me believe either of them as characters or as lovers for that matter. We're just told to believe their love because they fuck after a day and a half together, but I wasn't convinced. We see so little of them interacting together in normal scenes, and towards the end of the film, after their fight, they sit and talk, and I actually enjoyed that scene because, like I said, we hadn't seen them do anything like this until that point in the film. I'll note here that this is fixed to a tremendous degree in the reboot. Reboot John and Jane spend so much time together being characters first, then lovers, and it works so much better. Like, I understand things had to be shortened for a film, but still, 1 or 2 scenes of them talking about being intimate without fighting or shooting would have gone a long way. One final nitpick. There's so little blood. In scenes, we see John shoot several people, no blood, absolutely no blood anywhere. There are people dying in the final scenes, and there is no blood. Sure, John and Jane have cuts and scrapes and bullet wounds that bleed a bit here and there, but there really isn't much blood in the film despite people being shot. Sure, it's PG-13, but still. When people are getting shot and there's not a lot of blood, it takes me out. I think I'm done talking about this film now. Leave a comment down below if you've seen it, and let me know your thoughts about it. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. Now we get to the fun part, the show. Unlike the movie, when the series was announced, I was moderately hyped. I'll watch anything with Donald Glover in it though, so. Unlike the film, the show starts off with a kick-ass action scene, one of the better action scenes in the show in my opinion, because there's less hand-to-hand combat, but I'll touch on that later. We see a random couple out in the middle of nowhere preparing for something. We're not sure what just yet. They grab their guns and suddenly an all-out war ensues. Bullets fly and in the end, the couple dies. I think this is a great way to start the show because it subverts expectations and it also intrigues. And if you keep watching, you're rewarded. This scene alone makes very little sense, but as the show goes on, pieces of the puzzle begin to fall into place, and by the end, it makes total sense. After all that, we meet our first main character, Jane, played by Maya Erskine, whom some of you may know from the show Pen 15, which I haven't seen, but I've heard great things about. Similar to the film, we're introduced to our 2 main characters through interviews. Well, sort of. They're talking to a computer, the infamous hi I mentioned earlier, which only types back its responses. The interview scenes give the actors a good chance to show off and give audiences some hints about their characters. I think both interviews are pretty interesting, if not a bit shallow and vague, which actually serves a purpose this time around, considering our 2 lead characters are expected to give up their past identities in favor of new ones. I actually quite like the character introductions here, far more than in the film. We get a sense of these characters as people, and when we see them interacting for the first time, it means a lot more than it did in the film. I think the show's score helps a lot with the overall mystique and intrigue the opening scenes provide. The show's action theme has been stuck in my head since I heard it, and I like that because the song is great. As our 2 characters meet, we watch in real time as they feel each other out. Their initial interactions feel authentic. How would you react to learning you're about to start spending all your time living with a total stranger? Not only that, but the 2 of you have to bond enough to have each other's back on dangerous missions. As it turns out, the characters actually have unique personalities in this show, which is a huge upgrade from the film. Erskine's Jane is sort of the standard, no feelings, not attached, stolid one. She's focused on their mission and nothing else. Glover's John is a bit more hard to pin down. He's fun and funny, certainly caring, but he doesn't necessarily fit into the archetypal spy character. He certainly doesn't fall into the badass spy that Pitt's John did in the film. Glover's John is unique, and I like that. They go on their first mission, all while learning more about each other, and in turn establishing themselves to the audience as characters. As far as the plot goes, episode 1 is a MacGuffin hunt for a seemingly innocuous package. By the end, the audience quickly learns to question everything the show presents, which is a good thing. I actually love this first episode a lot. It sets up the show's personality and gives audiences enough to chew on, but not too much that they fill up. It definitely leaves you wanting more, which is important for any show. I was very keen to keep watching upon finishing this first episode. Episode 2 demonstrates the show's star power as it features Paul Dano in a tasteful cameo, though it's a bit more than that because he's in 3 total episodes this season. I absolutely adore most of the films and shows he's in as well, which reveals more of my biases here. But his inclusion goes a bit further than just a cameo, as I said, because his character beckons audience attention. What's his deal? Why is he so interested in Jane's life? The show is really good at building on intrigue, and this episode is no exception. While it doesn't feel as high octane as the previous episode, it delivers on another factor: weirdness. Yep, you heard it here first. The show has a fair bit of oddity, which I'm learning is a staple for the Glover-Marai team. Hiro Murai being the director of several of the show's episodes. He also directed most episodes of Atlanta, Glover's previous show, which concluded in 2022, also one of my favorite shows of all time. Atlanta was a surrealist comedy, and it worked really well for that show and its story. This show is similarly a comedy, but it's not nearly as surreal, though as I said, it does have some of those surreal elements. Anyway, Mission 2 is to infiltrate a silent auction to find and talk to the highest bidder, which turns out to be John Turturro, another fantastic actor. I saw some people had some issues with his appearance in this episode, but I found it to be fine. He played an eccentric billionaire, and he fit the role nicely. It's quite funny to see him lose his shit as he's tripping on truth serum, which I think is where fans of his had an issue with his appearance in this episode, but still. Quickly, romantic tension begins building between John and Jane. It's very clear that these two are going to fall for each other at some point. It's just a matter of when. I should note that at the episode's start, these two vow not to have sex because it could interfere with work. Jane takes the lead with that sentiment, and it's great character building considering this iteration of Jane isn't interested in romance, just work. However, at the end of the episode, after the two have failed their mission, they end up doing it. Chekhov's gun and all that. Side note, I love that they fail missions in this show. It's so cool and adds another layer of intrigue to the show and the characters. How do they each react when they fail, etc., etc. We don't even see John and Jane from the film do a single mission together, unless you count them working together at the end to shoot all the bad guys, which doesn't count in my opinion. Just in their area, the film was lacking for my taste. Now, one of my critiques I do have for the show is the speed at which they move with the romance. In episode 1, Jane makes it very clear that she isn't interested in romance at all. She doesn't want John to be interested in her either. Now, in episode 2, they're having sex. It feels a bit rushed. Sure, we've learned a lot about their characters in just 2 episodes, but it still feels too fast for me. We haven't earned the romance just yet. We haven't witnessed the pair go through enough for them to become so attached so quickly. I think now would be as good a time as any to talk about the elephant in the room, race-swapped characters. Why, I hear you all asking, would they take 2 perfectly believable white assassins and make them black and Asian for the reboot? Let me ask you this, is a reboot only acceptable if the characters' races remain the same? If John and Jane were also white in this reboot, would this outrage abate? The answer is, I don't know. We only live in a world where these 2 characters have been recast as different races, which I find to be totally acceptable. Great even, considering the actors are fantastic. However, I do take issue with the complaints regarding this critique in particular. We see it all the time. Any remakes or reboots with racially different characters are immediately called into question. The live-action Little Mermaid, for example. I can explain this concept rather easily for those who aren't familiar with it. When a character is created as white, that's just that. There isn't anything inherently political about it. It's the default. When I say default, I don't mean it as an insult. I mean, if you're from the US, and I think this may be true overseas as well, we've all grown up in a media environment where being white is seen as normal, and our media reinforces that. On the contrary, when a character is created as black, this character takes on an entirely different meaning. Because we aren't living in a world where being black is seen as the default or the norm, creating black characters or recasting existing characters as black or brown makes the media they're in political. Because of racism in America and the systemic oppression of people of color, characters can't simply be black for no reason, not in the same way that characters can be white. Almost no characters are defined by their whiteness, therefore changing it is of little consequence. The people who get offended by race swapping don't understand that. A perfect example is the live-action Little Mermaid. Ariel, a fictional mermaid, might I add, was portrayed by a black actress in the live-action film. People lost their collective minds over this change. Why make Ariel black? They screamed. They're just trying to erase the original, but their outrage is unfounded. No one is replacing the original film by having Ariel be black in the live-action version. The original will always exist. Ask yourself this, how many black princesses exist within Disney? Not many. Does it truly hurt so bad to see this character portrayed by a black actress? What is being so irrevocably changed about the character through this casting decision? I've yet to see any compelling arguments. Ariel is a mermaid first and foremost. Her whiteness hasn't got anything to do with her character. Ariel could exist as any race, really, and still her core characteristics would remain the same. I hear people say this. What if we race-swapped black characters then? That wouldn't be the same. As I said, black characters are created intentionally. Their blackness is almost always pivotal to the story that is being told about them. Changing, for example, Martin Luther King Jr., which is something I've unironically heard people talk about, to white in a film adaptation of his life would fundamentally change his story, which is wholly based on his blackness and moving through America as a black man. Some people, after hearing me say all this, might think, people like you are the real racists. You make everything about race. But are we? Are people that think like me boycotting and raging on social media about films and TV shows starring white actors? You may also think, well, if the race of a character doesn't matter, why recast them in the first place? Imagine we lived in a world where that logic applied. Every created character was white and only white, and any reboots or remakes followed this formula as well. How boring would cinema be? Plus, it isn't accurate to the society we live in, where there are so many beautiful people of all races and shades. Media is a reflection of society, so I think it's important to have characters that reflect people in that society. My question for people who think recasting characters is bad is, when do you think it's acceptable to have black actors in films or television? Believe it or not, inclusion is very important. Your outrage at seeing white characters recast as black is only a fraction of the anger people of color have had for decades as we've been discriminated against. The world doesn't need any more of that, especially not over fictional characters. There's an interesting character moment at the start of episode 3. The targets this time around are talking to each other, and one mentions something called a naked moment. John doesn't know what this means, but Jane does and explains that it's therapy speak. It's such a small detail, but it makes Jane feel a bit more authentic as a character. We know from previous episodes that she's almost a bit emotionally stunted. She doesn't connect with people in the same way John does. Therefore, it would make sense to assume that at some point in her life she's tried therapy. This is conjecture on my behalf, of course, but still, her knowing therapy speak rounds her out as a character and makes her believable, which is a step up from the film version of Jane, who doesn't really have any moments like this. I don't think I've mentioned how gorgeous the cinematography in this show is. It's fantastic. Mariah really shows off with this episode as well. We're in the mountains and we feel their scale relative to our characters. We see the fierce winds and the tremulous snow. We feel nature's fury here. But also, we see the serenity of it, the beauty. It all looks incredible. Part of the main conflict between Jane and John in this episode is that it's revealed that despite saying he has, John has not cut ties with his mother and speaks to her daily. It's another one of those great character moments because in episode 1 we hear John hesitate when being asked if he'll be able to cut all ties with his past, including his mother. It also differentiates John from Jane in that Jane would never break a rule as crucial as this one, and also that she's just not as close to her family as John is to his. While so far I've sung this episode's praises, I do have some critiques for it as well. Notably, this episode introduces one of the key issues I have with the show, the action. In the final 15 or so minutes of the episode, there's an extensive action scene between John and a group of captors attempting to abduct one of their targets. Now, I'm no combat connoisseur. I don't know what goes on behind the scenes to make combat in films and television look realistic, but I feel that something is lacking when it comes to the combat here. I can just tell the actors are pulling their punches, and it takes me out of the show and cuts the tension. There's also more plot armor here as well. These captors all have weapons, and when it comes to shooting a slow-moving target, John, walking through the snow wearing a red parka, they miss every single shot. There's a decent span of time where they have a clear aim at him, but don't hit. I understand he's our main character, and we're only 3 episodes into the show, but still, we need to believe that our characters are in at least a little bit of danger here. So when everything's said and done, and John's life is saved, we come to the end of the episode where Jane admits she really likes John. Now this would be fine if it didn't feel so rushed. We've only been with these characters for 3 episodes at this point. We've seen them go from saying no sex in episode 2 to them having sex in the same episode. What makes it feel worse is that Jane said she wasn't interested in romance at all. I just feel like she should be a bit more hesitant to admit something like that to John so soon after saying she wasn't interested in romance. What's worse is I knew the writers were going to have her say that. The setup was there. Character near death saying to the other, "You don't really care about me, do you?" It felt entirely too cliched for a show so carefully crafted as this one. 4 episodes in and we've arrived at mid-season. Episode 4 is a decently entertaining one, but I do have a gripe right out the gate. Jane and John are in a farmer's market when John notices someone he used to know. Of course, being John, he says something to her and they begin to speak, etc., etc. Strangely enough, Jane doesn't bat an eye here. Instead, the show focuses on how Jane is a bit jealous of this interaction. It's fine to establish Jane can be jealous, but we're coming off an episode where she was furious with John for staying in contact with his mother and not telling her. We should at least see Jane a bit upset at John for breaking cover and speaking to this woman, which undoubtedly puts them and their secret identity at risk. Now, this episode touches on a ponderance I had while watching the film, and that is, how had film Jane and John not run into any other assassins before? How had they never run into each other? Was their organization so big that hits never overlapped? In this episode, our John and Jane run into a different pair of spies, who all call John 2 and Jane 2 for the sake of clarity. There's a bit of foreshadowing in one of the things John 2 says, and I actually missed it the first time I watched this episode. Like I said before, I love how the show catches and builds intrigue with audiences. It's always planting little seeds that leave you wondering if they'll be explored later, and they almost always are. This episode definitely takes its time introducing us to John 2 and Jane 2. They get invited to our John and Jane's house for dinner, and much of the episode just consists of dialogue between the two couples. I read some reviews about people saying the writing in this show was cringe, but I never found that to be the case. What I've learned with Glover is that his dialogue is very naturalistic. He and Erskine actually play really well off each other in their scenes together, and it sold them as a married couple to me when I watched. They're both charming and funny in their own ways, and I like that about their performances. But anyway, turns out John 2 and Jane 2 are crazy party animals who invite our John and Jane to go with them on a mission. The only catch is John 2 and Jane 2 aren't coming with them. Things get hectic. Our John and Jane are in immediate danger. In cliche fashion, during the dangerous encounter, John tells Jane for the first time in the series that he loves her. We're 4 episodes in. It doesn't feel like we've earned this yet. Anyway, action ensues, and then we cut away. And can I just say, I don't like the sound effects they use for the action in the show. They use like stock cartoon punching sound effects that I recognized almost immediately, and it took me just right out of the episode. Anyway, we don't see the action or how they escape. We catch up with them after, which is fine, I guess. But something else about the show that bugs me is each episode's runtime. I feel like there's room for more in each of these episodes. The first and last episodes run a bit longer than everything else, and it just so happens those are my 2 favorites. Each subsequent episode is roughly 45 minutes long, which feels short to me. I guess I'm just used to watching longer form episodic content. Now, I don't want them to pad out episodes with BS, not at all. I just feel like some concepts, especially the romance, could do with being a bit more fleshed out in this series. Time passes between episodes, I'm assuming, and in that time, John and Jane are growing closer. But we need to see that. It's vital character information. Glover and Erskine have great chemistry, but I want to believe their characters do as well. Show us in real time them falling in love. Have Jane be opposed to it at first, maybe even upset at herself, but gradually giving in. Don't show me sex scenes in the 2nd episode and I love yous in the 4th. It's a bit too fast-paced for me. I didn't care much for episode 5. This episode stars Ron Perlman, who I think is a fantastic actor, but he isn't very good here, and it's not for the reasons you think. Ron's old now, and it's very evident that moving around is problematic for him. And it just so happens that this episode has a lot of running and walking in it. Because of Perlman's inclusion, the action in this episode unfolds at a snail's pace. There are scenes of John and Jane walking through narrow Italian passageways with gunmen actively firing at them and just missing, despite the fact that they're moving at a snail's pace with a 6-foot-tall man. We're supposed to believe our characters' lives are in danger here yet again. This is a high-stakes mission, but it doesn't feel like it because clearly each of these enemies is purposefully missing their mark. The writing in this episode tries to play it off, making jokes at Perlman's expense about him not moving quickly enough, but that isn't enough for me. It kills the realism when our characters are in no real danger. I'm almost convinced that the people pursuing John and Jane don't actually want to kill them. While driving, they're being shot at constantly and not a single bullet comes close to hitting John, Jane, or Perlman. This episode does have some very funny moments, though, I'll admit that. One moment that I found to be super funny was a scene where John and Jane were about to get hot and heavy on the balcony outside, and Perlman bangs on the glass and says, "I think I threw up." It's timed so perfectly, and it came out of left field. I didn't expect it. It was very funny. I find it interesting that we learn a bit more about Jane than we do John throughout the course of the series. We learn that he wants children and Jane doesn't, which is an important character moment for her. We also learn that the organization favors Jane over John, something we see in this episode in particular. We see her at several points, messaging Hi, who seems to be taking particular interest in her and her professional development within the organization. Though I think the romance moves too quickly, it is an interesting and defining moment to have Jane turn down job advancement and swapping out her John for a new one in favor of staying with her current John. She said that she really cares for John 2 episodes ago, and this action really proves it. Episode 6 takes a page out of the film's book, being primarily focused on marriage counseling. I don't have too much to say about this episode other than it feels a bit like it lacks focus. It's one of those episodes where characters discuss previous missions and we get little glimpses into what happened, rather than having the episode focus solely on 1 or 2 of them. This kind of storytelling can be effective, but I'm not a particular fan of it here. There are some decent character moments throughout as much of the episode as Jane and John talking with their counselor about their issues. There's another fight scene in this one, and like most of the others in the show, it doesn't quite look right. I'd like to see them work on the fight choreography in Season 2, make it a lot cleaner, more fluid, and more believable. Episode 7 is cool. The pace slows way down and we get more intimate drama where there's much more talking and a lot less action. Much of this episode takes place in one apartment, and that's pretty neat. I appreciate it when shows and films do something interesting with their setting. By this point, I sound like a broken record, but the fight scenes in this episode suffer from much the same as the issues I've been talking about, with staging and execution. This episode serves a similar purpose to scenes before the climax in the film, John and Jane closing in on a target that more or less is worthless and serves the purpose of bringing them together to ultimately turn against one another. I don't have too much to say about this episode either, and I do want to spend some time talking about the finale in detail, so I'll wrap it up with this. Throughout the entire season, we've gone through the highs and lows of John and Jane's relationship, in a much more substantial way than was explored in the film. I'd expect little else given the creative minds behind the series and the space afforded to them across 8 episodes, whereas the movie had a just under 2-hour runtime. I love how the show truly explores these two people as characters and only uses the fact that they're spies to enhance the character drama already baked into the show. Alright, on to the finale. I started this review off saying that episodes 1 and 8 were my 2 favorite episodes. That still stands. Episode 1 for its slow build and introduction to our main characters, and episode 8 for the complete opposite reason. The previous episode ends with the two going their separate ways. John says he's done and he leaves. This episode starts with Jane going about her life without him. The beginning lowers your expectations. It's all pretty mundane until gunshots ring out and we're told that Jane received instructions to kill John. Of course, John isn't going to stand by and let this happen, so the two launch into a battle, much like John and Jane in the film. One of the things I appreciate about the finale is its ability to balance tone and pacing. Jane and John are actively attempting to kill each other, and they aren't cracking jokes or trying to be funny while doing it. The scenes they're in together this time around are quite serious, and it works so well. The episode punctuates its action with scenes of our main characters, both interacting with different reoccurring characters. John spends some time with Paul Dano, or Hot Neighbor as he's known in the show, and Jane sits down with John's mother, who we finally meet in person for the first time in this episode. These scenes don't feel like padding, and they don't bog down the episode whatsoever. I can't talk much about what happens in these scenes without spoilers, so I won't go much further. Just know they're really, really good. When the two finally meet up again, the action kicks right back up to a 10, once again, pulling from the film with the sprawling gunfight inside their home. There's a bit of plot armor in these scenes as well, but they do give good reason as to why that is later on, which I'll accept. There's a bit of hand-to-hand that's tolerable in this episode as well. It definitely feels more realistic than the previous fight scenes have, and I promise I'm not just saying that because I like this episode. Right when you think it's over, a plot twist is revealed and the show gets even better. I won't spoil what happens in the final scenes of the show because it just came out. It's so new and I want people to see this video and go watch the show. So if you haven't seen it, please go and watch it. The ending is quite open, setting up the possibility for a second season, which I'm confident there will be. If for some reason there isn't, the ending is still pretty satisfying. It balances the need for more with appreciation for what the show's already given us. It's very clear to me that a lot of love went into the creation of this show. It doesn't all feel sloppily put together or rushed. The narrative is cohesive, the action is okay, so long as they're not fighting hand to hand, and the story overall is interesting. I like all the changes they made to the original. I like that instead of just chance meeting, these two characters are assigned to one another by an organization. I also like how these two characters feel like real people, unlike the John and Jane of the original film, which felt like cutouts. While I do have a lot of praise to sing the show, there were still elements of it that disappointed me. The episodes, minus the first and final, were just too dang short for what the story was trying to accomplish. It was clear that the studio wanted to get the series out and see if people were actually cared and watched it. Notice how all 8 episodes were available immediately, not weekly. This tells me they were testing the waters with this show to see if people actually like it and want more. I think part of that impact is having so few episodes, only 8 this season, and relatively shorter episodes at that. I'm not advocating for milking a story past its expiration. I hate when streaming services do that. Netflix is notorious for milking the hell out of their IPs. Longer episodes would benefit a show like this that's so focused on character building and romance. Because action is such a big part of the show, I really want to see them get better with it, especially the hand-to-hand. It wasn't too believable in this season, and I know it could be so much better. I don't have many complaints story-wise. I think the narrative flowed smoothly, and the missions shown were interesting. I definitely want to see more high-stakes missions in Season 2. The first and final episodes were my favorite, partly because the way the missions were integrated with the story. The first episode had a great evolution from a MacGuffin to real stakes, and it subverts expectations, as I've said before. The final episode is just insane in all the best ways. As far as Season 2 speculations go, I sure hope they don't go the parent spies with a baby route. It's a trope that is beyond worn out at this point, and I personally hate it. John wants a baby and Jane doesn't. It's part of their conflict as a couple, and it's effective in demonstrating the differences between the two and what they want out of their relationship. However, I don't think it would be wise to bring a baby into the show because it just has been done so many times before. It would only add to the plot armoring, since there's no way the baby would ever be in any real danger. I think the best episodes from this season focus on the dynamics between Glover and Erskine, and that should carry over into the next season. More missions, more romance. That's what I want to see. I really appreciated the chemistry between Glover and Erskine. It felt very real to me, much more so than Pitt and Jolie in the film. I only believed them as lovers because apparently Pitt was cheating on his wife at the time with Jolie, and people thought it was hot, I guess. But like I said, I didn't find the original film to be all that hot, really. Equally, I didn't find this show to be all that hot either, just because the romance was a little rushed. But I see far more potential for hotness in the show than there ever was in the film. These characters clearly care about each other, and by the end, that's cemented. In the film, we're told the characters care about each other, not really shown it. All in all, I enjoyed this show. I may have sounded harsh in this review, but I did like it, which is why I felt the need to point out areas that are holding it back. There's golden potential here for another hit show from Glover, so I hope they go to the table with brand new and innovative ideas to keep this story going strong in a season 2. Right now, I'm feeling the show is a solid 7.5 out of 10, which reading out feels a bit low, but honestly it seems right to me. Let me know what you think of the show in the comments, and if you haven't watched it, please do so. You won't regret it. Don't subscribe if you don't want to, but if you feel I've made any good points in this video, be my guest, and don't forget to hit the like button while you're at it. Take care.